Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to this Lockdown Litfest event where we are delighted to be able to bring to your screens two huge stars. As ever, I'm going to start by saying this. We are living in troubled and anxious times, and all of us at Lockdown Litfest, we hope you are safe, we hope you're well, and we hope that you're being careful and looking after the ones you love, and that they indeed are looking after you. Janet Todd was born in Wales and grew up in Bermuda, Sri Lanka, England, and Scotland. She's written a number of biographies, one of which was Aphra Behn, and three linked ones on Mary Wollstonecraft, her Irish protege Lady Mountcashel, and her daughters Fanny Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley. Her latest book is called Don't You Know There's a War On? And she's going to be interviewed by Miriam Margolyes. Miriam Margolyes, OBE, is the British-Australian actress and voice artist whose early roles were in theatre, and after several supporting roles in film and television, won a BAFTA award for her role in Martin Scorsese's The Age of Innocence. Some of you may know her better as Professor Sprout in the Harry Potter series. Would you please give a very warm welcome to Janet Todd and Miriam Margolyes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, let me first of all say I've read this book and I think it's absolutely wonderful. And I wanted to ask Janet, may I read a couple of pages from it and then ask you some questions? Is that okay?
That would be wonderful, Miriam, and I would love you to be reading with your splendid voice.
This is near the beginning of the book. August 1975. Why not write something of your life? I have no life. Phyllis says. Maude stopped as she heard me expel breath. Right, I said after a pause. I'll be disciplined, just occasionally, not everything. I smiled. She turned away, giving no answering smile. Writing is diuretic. It shouldn't be undertaken if you aren't near a lavatory. No siree, as the Yank said to Rachel when he went off unsatisfied, refusing to hand over the nylons. It's like taking a dose of salts. Why did she suggest it? Maude rarely initiates. Does she want me to reflect on us, on mother and daughter? Her widdershins way of asking? We're not that sort of family. We don't wear our hearts on our sleeves. Does she wish to know about herself at the beginning? Or does she want to know about me? I doubt the latter. Children are so self-centered. Besides, it would be unseemly. No getting away, though. There's been a change these last weeks. Something's a little different. She's not introspective. No point interrogating. The notebooks she's brought home for me are cheap and lined with pale blue covers. From Woolworths, pinched from school. I'll get more if you need them, she says. Why is she encouraging me? It's not her place. Shall I start with birth? If you like. Maude shrugs. Don't you have an opinion, dear? Begin with a war. You often mention it. Do I? Maybe I do. Yes, the early years before the Americans. No, the later part. Is she mocking me? If she is, Phyllis taught her the trick. That's not the real war. So start with yourself. She's silent. Then with her back turned to me, she says, Phyllis is getting married. I sat down. She can't be. So there we have the two characters, mother and daughter. How did you find them, Jan?
Well, I suppose what I did is I listened. I heard Joan, and then the daughter came along almost as interlocutor and explanation of some of the problems and intricacies of Joan's situation and voice. But Joan, I find a very strange sort of character, something that has haunted me, I think, through life, because it is an amalgam of some of the views and ways of being of people of my mother's generation. Well, not being my mother, I say hastily. But I also had an actual beginning of this book, and it goes back into my childhood, where I walked past, as quite a young child, a house with the curtains drawn. And I learnt that this held a mother who might have been a widow or a spinster, one didn't know in those days, who had a daughter who had been educated, which was a remarkable thing, I found, and had become a doctor and had a what was called a breakdown and returned to her mother. And the two of those had lived in their house with the curtains drawn. And I only went past a few times, but I never saw them open. And so I had lived a little bit with the imagination of that claustrophobic house, of the two of them, the two women, making a life with all the repressions and the oppressions and the openness that two women who are mother and daughter would have. Because after all, the mother-daughter tie is the most basic. And so I started with that. And then as I read more about mothers and daughters, I suppose, and other things, it always seemed to me that the daughter was talking. The daughter was telling her story. If a mother was monstrous, unaffectionate, or lacking in some way, it was always the daughter who grumbled and moaned. And I think that's still largely the case in novels. So I wanted to take the pen out of the daughter's hand, and for the first, well, not the first time, I wouldn't claim that, but for a rather unusual time, give it to the unloved and unlovable and unlikable mother. So the bulk of my book, as you know, is indeed the diary, or rather the monologue of the mother, Joan, who starts to tell her story under the influence of her daughter's querying and this change in their circumstance, where the only friend they have, Phyllis, has married.
Well, writing is always a kind of revealing. As you turn each page, you learn new facts. At the very beginning of the novel, I thought that it was a horror story. Then I thought it was a rather frightening depiction of a relationship between a mother and daughter. And then I was really hooked into the unravelling of what is really going on, what is happening behind those curtains. Do you enjoy unravelling? Is that, I mean, did you have, before you started the book, the complete plan in your mind, or did it happen as the book happened?
I think the latter. It really did. She started to live so much that I started to think I could talk in her voice. I started almost to ventriloquize her. And then when I'd actually finished the book, it went the other way. I started to see her in the street and think, there's my Joan. But she does unravel, and I didn't plan the incidents that occurred. They seemed necessary as she went on. What I was trying to convey with her is the notion that is so much against what we now think, that we should let everything hang out. We should, if we go back into our past, if we delve into our parents, into everything that happened to us, we will know more. We want to psychologize everything. We think therapy is an absolute good. But I think my parents' generation had quite often the idea of let sleeping dogs lie. And I think with Joan, once she starts tampering with the past, instead of it liberating her, it begins a slippery and slidey slope into a sort of horror.
It is a horror. She is almost a monster, isn't she? She's almost a monster. But then the charm of the book, and there is not a lot of charm, by the way, it is frightening. It is so scarring. I think I've carried it about with me in my head ever since I've read it. And I couldn't put it down. I mean, I read it right off. You know, like when people say they can't put a book down, I really couldn't. I was scared to put it down. I couldn't leave them, the two of them, and the extra person that you concoct at the very beginning of the book, but she never really appears again. What fascinated me was how you set it so specifically in a middle class situation in the period just after the war. It's a very specific time, isn't it? Could you have set it at any other time, or did you see it in those colours of the war and just after the war?
Oh, I saw it absolutely as that time. I think she's absolutely a woman of that time and of that class. I mean, it is so specifically the lower middle class, a class that was aspirational, uneducated on the whole, that expected and that believed in before the war particularly, believed in a kind of old-fashioned patriotism, in the value of culture that they didn't necessarily have. And after the war, this kind of woman is almost a misfit, is an outsider. She's not really wanted anymore. The other thing, of course, that happens is that the war, like any other war, like the First World War and periods in the 19th century, meant that there were more women than men around. And as women were pushed out of the workforce and back into the home, there was an emphasis on wifeliness. And if you were not a wife, if you were a woman alone, then what were you? You were suddenly a sort of surplus woman. So I think that's important. But I want to stress the lower middle classness of it, because I think that now we tend to mock the aspirational efforts of that class, and maybe it's partly extinct, but when I tried to think of a positive depiction of such a class, it struck me that the only thing I could think of was Hyacinth Bucket, who is a comic picture of such a woman. But yet there is something that the upper middle class, to which this class aspires, find so comic. They find it, they despise it, they're contemptuous of it. And it's very painful to the aspirational lower middle class. And the other thing I just want to say about that is that the generation of my parents believed so immensely in education. And they thought that education would not only bring, as we think now, for self-fulfillment and more money, but it would bring class and self-confidence and the privilege that they saw in the class above them. And we now know it doesn't, but they didn't. And so what I've done with Joan is show how much she yearned for it. But then when her daughter has it, it's an immense disappointment, because the girl, first of all, is not herself, as mothers so often think they might be, but are not. But more to the point, education does not deliver these things for Maude. So she has this double disappointment. And the whole thing turns inwards into a monstrous cruelty.
That is the feeling that I got while I was reading, that these two women, so bound to each other, living in this dreary house, they were, in a sense, almost destroying each other, weren't they? I didn't feel the usual love that you expect to find with a family. It's unloving. It's quite destructive. I mean, this little passage comes just before she started teacher training. Maude, that's the daughter, said, "You might like to go out to work." A remark with the ring of Phyllis. "I've no qualifications. What would I do?" Did she want her mother selling turnips on a market stall or cleaning public lavatories? "So here's my day. Can you laugh with your mouth closed? Is a ha-ha laugh when you do? We have the telegraph delivered till April. When the subscription offer lapses, we'll stop keeping up with the world." It's just, there is a sourness, would you agree? And yet it is compelling. This is what I want very much to get across, that I feel that two people are destroying each other, but it's gripping to read.
But I do think she's sour and she's bitter, but I wanted to suggest a very energetic bitterness. I wanted her to be very vital. And there's a little humour in the way she regards herself and other people. And she's not entirely without self-knowledge, but at the same time, she has in our terms, in our modern progressive terms, she would have a great ignorance of herself, as she had a great ignorance of sexuality, which gets her into some of this muddle and confusion. But I hope that that she tried to make her bitterness energetic, and only when it starts really to fall apart, as she starts to admit what has happened and the fact that she has wounded herself as well as being wounded by the world, only then does I think it really gets destructive of Maude. Because I tried to suggest that Maude wasn't so totally unhappy before. She was dominated by this woman, but she led a little life. She liked walking to the park. She didn't dislike her teaching. It was only when it started to unravel that everything went completely pear-shaped. That's not to mean that Joan, the mother, was ever happy. She can't be. She has lacerated herself too much. But she has a vitality of expression, I hope. She reads, she lives, she has instead of having a sort of an adult sexuality, as we would now call it, she lives in a sort of sensual world of poetry, of a childhood world in which the words almost stood for the things. So I wanted to suggest that this may be very odd and very eccentric, but that we shouldn't perhaps be too intolerant of eccentricity. I think as time has gone on, we've become more and more intolerant of eccentrics, apart from very elaborate, sort of wonderful, aristocratic eccentrics. But middle class, lower middle class eccentrics, I think, who are also intolerant. I think we have become very intolerant. Let's put it, we're very intolerant of intolerance.
You mentioned that it's funny. Well, I didn't find it funny. I must be honest, there is one bit that did make me laugh. In a very nasty part of the book, she says, on the lavatory door as I stood up, the pile of sodden paper, flannel and handkerchief in both hands, I read words scrawled in red chalk. A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. Below it, in pink lipstick, someone had drawn the outline of a smiling fish riding a bike. That is funny, but it also, and I would like to make this point, it doesn't show men in a terribly good light. And men don't appear in this book in a terribly good light, do they?
They don't, but that's because she lives in a world of women, largely. Her father was largely absentee, and her experience, as those who get to the book will know, with a man is not a happy one. So her world is a female world, though her dreams are of sort of beautiful hermaphrodites almost, because of her weird asexuality. But I would like to take issue with the idea that there aren't other funny bits. I mean, it's about embarrassment, because I think of all the attributes of the lower middle class, I'd want to stress its sense of embarrassment would almost be the biggest. I think it has an acute sense of the embarrassment. The upper orders don't, and the very lower orders don't either. But this class is constantly worrying what other people think, how they look, what they might be, in some way they may be infringing the respectable codes. Whatever they put on their wall, they worry that somebody will come in and despise it. And it's not just the three ducks flying on the wall either. It's everything. It's the coasters and the doilies and the wrong flowers. And, the suffering of it is immense, and perhaps not understood by those from the upper middle class who went to the better public schools, who will know from the start whether you've got a tumbler or a whatever in your hand, and whether you should have champagne and flutes or other kinds of glasses. This is known from the start, and they know linguistically what to do. Whereas the autodidact I've described knows loads and loads of words because she reads all the time, but she doesn't use them. She doesn't know how they would be used in actual conversation because she hasn't heard the conversations. So I think that embarrassment is both awful and funny, I hope. Some of it, I realise that the toilet scene is perhaps not overwhelmingly funny and very embarrassing. But occasionally, I mean, she talks. She becomes lonely when she starts to tell her life, because the horror of it starts to impinge on her in a way it hadn't really before. She was a bit sleepwalking almost. And then she starts talking to the spin dryer. And I hoped that was somewhat humorous. And she also imagines the upper middle class occasionally talking to her in her sort of dull little kitchenette. She imagines these upper class strains, these splendid accents coming through and talking to her. Or she imagines Vita Sackville West coming through the front door and walking straight out the back. I mean, I thought that she had a sort of bitter kind of humour that one might respond to. But
yes, no. You're right about that. There is a mordant humour, but it's not at all a funny book. I wouldn't class it as such.
It's not a funny predicament.
It's a riveting account of the soul's disintegration. And I found it profound and tragic, actually. It's the kind of opposite of Barbara Pym. Happening at the same time, in a sense, as Barbara Pym's world. A bit later, actually, but a female world, yes. And set within its own class, for sure. And I think you're bringing to life the miseries of the lower middle class is fantastic. It's Dickensian. That's how high I would praise it.
That is praise from you.
It's praise from me because he came from that world, and my mother came from that world, and it is savagely wanting to go up, aspiring, savagely aspiring. I always remember Mummy saying to me, I want you to go to Cambridge because I want you to be able to talk to anybody about anything. And well, that's the longing that I feel from Joan in this book. She longs for something that she, in a sense, never will have.
Since we're doing mothers, I might say that my mother, when I, in great surprise to everybody, got into Cambridge and met you, which was a delight, said to me, well, if you can't get married there, you won't anywhere. Since the ratio of girls to boys was, I think, 1 to 11. But I didn't. So there was a sad disappointment. So, I mean, I have very much more loving parents, and so did not suffer quite from what Joan has suffered. But to go back to her, I think it's Philip Larkin who said that deprivation is to him what daffodils are to Wordsworth. And I would say that misfits and outsiders and outliers, whatever you want to call them, people who don't fit in and are not valued that much by society, they are to me the daffodils.
I think it's interesting that you are absorbed by the struggles of life, and most writers today seem to be absorbed by the successes of life. And I prefer somebody who tries to anatomize the struggles that we go through.
Well, I do accept it's not a feel-good book. But I think there is something energetic about a struggle, even if it's a fail. I mean, I think what I've tried to do with Joan is to describe somebody who in the end knows her failure. She talks about these dreadful poems they used to recite, like Invictus, where you're supposed to have your unconquerable soul. And it's a very male business, you know, that you will stand whatever life throws at you, you will have your unconquerable soul. And I think her experience is that no, the soul does become conquered, but that as you go down into your pit, maybe you can still talk.
Say not the struggle naught availeth.
Yes, well, it does. It does rebel, actually, and she knows it, but she still tries to hold to these things. I think one shouldn't underestimate too the sort of patriotism of empire and struggle and stiff upper lip, all of that, which really these people were excluded from, but they believed in it all. I think one should not entirely discount the effect of losing all that, and not necessarily at this period. We're still in the 1950s and 60s, although my book is set in the 70s.
Is that world, has it gone, that world?
I assume that it is largely gone. But the fact of there is still a disjunction between the progressive elite, which thinks it owns all discourse and all culture, and those who don't necessarily agree with it or have access to it. And I have a feeling, although this has nothing to do with the book, that Brexit allowed us to see some of that in a way that we hadn't really done before. And that universities have taken themselves off in some ways and culturally, have almost separated themselves from the bulk of the culture of the place.
Could you imagine writing? Could you imagine writing another book about those two women and Phyllis, perhaps?
Well, I thought. Well, I couldn't take on Joan, obviously, considering the ending. But I did actually think about going on with Maude and Phyllis. They would move into a world in which homosexuality, lesbianism, which was so much a taboo in the 40s and 50s, as much a taboo as paedophilia is today, they could have had that. That would have been possible to them in a way that it could not have been possible to Joan. I don't think she is anything. I don't think she's defined as clearly as that. And one has to remember the total ignorance that girls were brought up in this period. So she doesn't, I don't think it's an option for her, but it is for those two. But whether they take that option, I'm not sure. Because it seems to me that Maude, I'd made Maude into somebody who, again, might well just be ordinarily heterosexual in a
yes, it's very hard to tell
because
whether she's gay or not.
She wants the affection. She wants what people tend to call homoerotic. She wants to be loved, and Phyllis has been loving her, and she needed that very, very badly. Whether she wanted, some sort of sexual relationship, as Phyllis obviously wanted, is another thing. But I thought about maybe trying to investigate them through another period. But I think I'll probably move on to other things at this point.
Oh, I hope you do go back on it, because it is sometimes the shadowy characters that take my interest. I mean, obviously, yes. Joan is compelling. I want to stress what a brilliant piece of writing you have achieved. The prose you use, the precision of the words, it's extraordinary. It's surgical, and I don't know anyone who writes like that now. People shovel words around, but you dissect them and you use them with such precision. It's glorious.
Thank you, Miriam. That is really extremely kind.
It's
I just wish I could hear your voice through the whole thing. I loved the way you read the beginning passage. Thank you.
Thank you both, ladies, very much indeed. I'm just going to do a little bit of an outro so that we can make it into a thing. So just stand by, hold your positions for a second, please. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this. It's been such a pleasure to have both Miriam Margolyes and Janet Todd discussing their book, discussing Janet's book, Don't You Know There's a War On. You may wonder why we featured this. We featured this for a very good reason. One, because of COVID-19, Janet has had her book launch cancelled, which was due to be held in Cambridge at the delightful independent bookstore Heifers. And of course, as you know, if you're a frequent Lockdown Litfest a participant, we are doing our utmost to support independent bookstores. But I'd also like to point out that we're very keen to get Janet as many readers as possible. She is the most exquisite writer, and it's not just me that thinks so. Emma Donoghue, who knows a thing or two about good writing, has said about Janet's writing, Todd has a good ear for tone and a deep understanding. Some of you may have heard of another writer called Hilary Mantel, who has written of Janet Todd's writing, frank, wry, and unexpectedly heartening. And if that's not good enough for you, Sally Vickers, a fine writer in her own, of herself, of course, has written of Janet's writing intriguing and entertaining, clever and beguiling. I will also point out that I did Janet a disservice in my introduction. She is also the holder of an OBE for her services to higher education and literary scholarship. And I hope you find that this last half an hour in the company of dear Miriam and wonderful Janet has shown how deserving Janet is of that accolade. Would you please put your hands together? Miriam Margolyes OBE and Janet Todd OBE. Thank you very much, both ladies, for joining us. And thank you to you, the audience. We hope as ever you keep well, you keep safe, and you keep enjoying what we're trying to offer you. Thank you all very much indeed. Cheerio.